They called her the help. That's what Dr. Hargrove said to his residents as she restocked the crash cart, her hands moving with precision that made expensive surgeons look lazy. She was threading a 22-gauge for catheter, smooth, clean, no wasted motion, when he walked past without seeing her. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above her head, and she didn't flinch at the insult. She never did. One measured breath. That was Danielle Ross's style: absorb, continue, survive. She had gotten very good at surviving. Mercy General's pediatric ICU in Savannah ran on a rhythm that felt almost like music if you listened long enough: the synchronized beeping of cardiac monitors, the hydraulic whisper of bed railings lowering, the soft click of supply cabinet latches closing. Danielle had worked in combat surgical tents in Ramadi, where the stakes felt heavier, where every second meant the difference between a young Marine going home or going home in a box. But this place, this fluorescent-lit sanctuary for sick children, demanded something different. It demanded invisibility. She kept her head down. Kept her hand steady when they wanted to shake. Kept the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, a reminder of who she had been, now folded against her ribs like a secret. 15 years that patch had been with her. 15 years since Ramadi. She touched it 3 times during each shift, a ritual she couldn't explain and couldn't stop. The fabric was worn smooth from her fingertips, softer now than it had ever been. Nobody noticed. Nobody looked at her long enough to notice anything. The shift started at 6:56 a.m. on a Tuesday in August, and Danielle was already at her station 15 minutes early, the way she always was. She had surgical tape in her left pocket, always in her left pocket, a reflex from trauma medicine where seconds mattered and preparation was the only prayer that actually worked. Her scrubs were the color of seafoam, chosen specifically because they didn't stand out, didn't draw attention, didn't suggest anything beyond ordinary competence. That was the goal. Ordinary. Competent. Forgotten. Morning rounds in 20, a resident called out, clipboard tucked under her arm like armor. Danielle nodded, didn't speak. Speaking meant conversations. Conversations meant being seen. She was checking the defibrillator pads when the intercom crackled to life. Incoming. 8-year-old male. Rare neurological presentation. Progressive paralysis onset over 4 weeks. ETA 5 minutes. Her hands paused for exactly 1 second. 8 years old. Paralysis. That combination meant something, meant parents terrified enough to try anything, meant medical teams running out of answers, meant a child whose body was betraying him with no way to stop it. She resumed her work without acknowledgement, but something inside her chest tightened, some old instinct from Ramadi that never quite went dormant. The ambulance arrived at 7:14 a.m., and Danielle positioned herself at the far corner of the receiving bay where she could move without being in the way but still respond if needed. The boy came through on a stretcher, eyes wide with the particular kind of fear that only 8-year-olds knew how to show, everything authentic, nothing held back. His father followed in Coast Guard dress uniform, blue jacket crisp despite the humidity that was already wilting everything else in Savannah. Commander Mitchell, the name on the intake sheet. The commander's face was the color of drywall, eyes tracking his son like a satellite locked onto dying frequency. Bay 3 is prepped, Dr. Hargrove announced, appearing beside them with the kind of entrance that required no introduction. His shoes cost more than Danielle made in 2 weeks. His tie was silk. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He glanced at Danielle, past her really, as if she was furniture. Get the vitals. Full neuropanel. I want baseline imaging before I round. She moved. Always she moved when ordered, accepting instructions the way some people accepted gravity, as fact, not suggestion. But she was watching the boy, really watching him, the way she had learned to watch in field hospitals where a patient's body told you truths their voice never would. The child's name was Marcus. Bright, according to his mother's notes in the chart. Loves basketball. 5th grade. For weeks ago he started dropping objects from his right hand. Then weakness in his legs. Then difficulty walking. Then the progression accelerated, and the parents drove him here, desperate, out of options, out of time. Danielle read the chart during pre-shift briefing, her eye scanning Dr. Hargrove's notes, rare presentation. Conservative approach warranted pending additional workup. Experimental protocols not recommended given current liability framework. That last line was telling. Not medical. Not about what was best for Marcus. About liability. During her break, 30 minutes stolen between 12-hour momentum, Danielle sat in the back corner of the break room with a personal notebook, the one she kept hidden in her locker, beneath the spare scrubs and the shoes she only wore at home. She was researching, had been researching for 6 years whenever a case caught her attention. Rare neurological conditions. Treatment protocols that existed on the edges of hospital approval. Her hands moved across the notebook pages with an old military precision, writing in a script so small only she could read it if she leaned close. Not trembling. Never trembling when it mattered. The experimental protocol was there in her notes, highlighted 3 times, circled, annotated with her own medical observations from the literature. It had shown 78% remission rates in early-stage presentations. Marcus was early-stage. The window was closing. She knew this the way she knew how to suture a wound under fire, how to stop hemorrhage with her hands, how to prioritize when everything was critical, from muscle memory that lived deeper than thought. She was folding the notebook when the Walter Reed nurse appeared in the doorway, a woman with sergeant shoulders and eyes that had seen things. Danielle didn't recognize her, but something in her bearing said the recognition would be mutual if Danielle ever revealed the truth. "Mind if I sit?" the Walter Reed nurse asked, gesturing at the empty chair. Danielle nodded once, kept her eyes on her coffee, black, cooling. The nurse Saturday. They didn't speak for nearly a minute. Then, during routine wound care on Marcus's biopsy site, the nurse had seen the suturing technique. 3 layers. Perfect tension. A method taught in combat trauma courses, practiced on cadavers and live tissue in theaters where mistakes cost lives. The kind of technique surgeons learned over years. The kind that appeared in a pediatric nurse's portfolio only if that portfolio contained classified history. "Where did you serve?" The question hung in the break room air like powder smoke. Danielle's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Her heartbeat didn't accelerate. That was discipline. That was the composure that had kept her alive when remedy was nothing but artillery and blood and the screams of young men who were too young to scream that loud. She set the coffee down with precise control. "I'm just a nurse," Danielle said quietly. The lie was smooth, practiced over 6 years of civilian existence, of reduced identity, of choosing silence over recognition. The Walter Reed nurse studied her for exactly 3 seconds. Then she nodded, understanding what wasn't being said, respecting the boundary that silence itself was establishing. She stood, touched Danielle's shoulder once, a gesture that meant she knew, would keep knowing, would never speak it aloud unless permission was given, and walked back toward the ICU without another word. Danielle sat alone in the break room for the remaining 12 minutes of her break, touching the unit patch through her jacket, feeling the raised embroidery beneath her fingertips. 15 years. That patch represented 15 years, represented remedy, represented a version of herself that couldn't coexist with the quiet nurse in seafoam scrubs who kept her head down and accepted condescension without response. Marcus deteriorated throughout the afternoon. His oxygen saturation dropped from 96% to 92%. His breathing became labored, the muscle weakness accelerating faster than the medical literature suggested it should. Danielle watched his vital signs the way a hawk watches rodents, constant, unblinking, recognizing patterns that others were too comfortable to notice. She was checking his foresight at 4:33 p.m. when Dr. Hargrove rounded, still wearing his confidence-like cologne. He glanced at the monitors, at Marcus's pale face, at the commander standing vigil in the corner of the room, and said, "Continued observation. We'll reassess in 48 hours." 48 hours was too long. Danielle knew this. But she didn't speak. Not yet. Not while the mask was still in place, while the help was still just help, while the woman in seafoam scrubs could be dismissed with a glance. She touched the unit patch through her jacket. 3 times, like always. A ritual that meant patience. Soon. The world wasn't ready yet to see what was beneath these scrubs. But Marcus was running out of time, and Danielle Ross was very, very good at acting when time was the enemy. The shift ended at 6:27 p.m. She clocked out and walked to her car through the Savannah humidity, feeling the patch against her ribs, feeling the weight of secrets that were about to become very loud indeed. The fluorescent lights hummed above Marcus Mitchell's bed like insects trapped in plastic. Danielle clocked back in at 7 a.m., her scrub still damp from the Savannah humidity, her chest tight beneath layers of cotton and secrets. Commander Mitchell stood at his son's bedside, shoulders rigid in the way only military spines know how to be. The boy lay motionless except for his eyes, which tracked his father with the kind of desperation that comes from a body that won't obey commands anymore. Dr. Hargrove swept into the room with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. He didn't greet Marcus. He didn't acknowledge the commander. He spoke at the chart in his hands as if the 3 other people in the room were furniture. Spinal cord inflammation is progressing as predicted. Standard protocol continues. Anti-inflammatory agents, physical therapy, observation. He turned the page without looking at anyone. Experimental treatments present liability the hospital cannot accept. We maintain standard of care. This child will benefit from patience and time. Danielle had read the same research that morning at 4 a.m., unable to sleep, her hand scrolling through the Walter Reed neurological study on her phone in the dark of her apartment. 82%. The number wouldn't leave her alone. 82% improvement with early intervention in pediatric cases. Marcus qualified on every metric. His inflammation was caught early. His age was ideal. His trajectory without intervention was already written in hospital charts across the country: paralysis, then the slow suffocation that comes when the nerves controlling your lungs decide to stop listening. She stepped forward. Her voice came out soft, the way she'd trained it to sound for 3 years in these hallways. The way a nurse speaks to doctors, a question, not a statement. Deferential. Negotiating from the weak side of a power gap she could have closed in seconds. Doctor, the Walter Reed study published last month shows 82% improvement with early intervention in pediatric cases with inflammation markers like Marcus's. The protocol includes intravenous immunoglobulin therapy followed by selective plasmapheresis. His labs qualify him for compassionate use exception. The room shifted. Not visibly. Rooms didn't shift visibly. But the air pressure changed the way it does before lightning. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He set the chart down slowly on the bedside table and turned to face her with a smile that looked like a predator showing teeth. Nurse Ross. His voice had the texture of expensive leather wrapped around broken glass. When you complete medical school, perhaps you may offer clinical opinions. Until that unlikely day arrives, I suggest you confine yourself to tasks appropriate to your training. Fetch warm blankets. Check vitals. Let professionals handle treatment decisions. Commander Mitchell's hands clenched into fists. But he was a commander in a system where authority flowed down through chains of command, and he was trapped in a hospital where he had no rank at all. Hargrove continued, his voice rising slightly, deliberately projecting beyond the room's walls. Danielle understood then. This wasn't about her. This was theater. This was him establishing dominance for an audience that didn't exist yet but would hear about it within the hour. Hospital liability trumps experimental fantasies. This institution has a board of directors who oversee risk management. That board would never authorize treatment protocols based on a nurse's emotional reactions to a difficult case. Danielle felt the words land like rounds. Each one precise. Each one designed to wound specifically because they addressed her deepest fear, that her judgment was compromised by emotion, that her military training in crisis response meant nothing in a place where credentials mattered more than competence, that speaking up made her dangerous to herself. But she held his eyes. That was the first rule of combat. The moment you look away, you've already surrendered. Visible means a child the board will read about when he dies from treatable paralysis, she said quietly. They'll read about it in a lawsuit. They'll read about it in a licensing review. They'll read about it in the news that runs the headline about the hospital that chose liability protection over a child's life. Hargrove's face went the color of old brick. He stepped backward, which meant she'd scored. In rooms filled with power plays, retreat was confession. He turned to Commander Mitchell instead, his voice dropping into the false intimacy of hospital conspirators. "Commander, I want you to understand something. Your son receives excellent care. But hospital nurses sometimes confuse compassion with competence. We cannot risk experimental protocols because subordinate staff have emotional reactions to difficult cases. It's not personal. It's professional responsibility." He left. His shoes clicked against the tile with the rhythm of a clock counting down. Danielle stood in the silence he left behind, aware of Marcus's eyes on her, aware of the commander's careful neutrality, aware that she'd just kicked a hornet's nest while wearing a target. The hallway outside was empty. Hargrove walked toward the nurse's station where the unit charge nurse was updating the daily assignment board. Danielle could see them from the doorway, his mouth moving, her mouth opening, her pen coming out. She saw him gesture back toward Marcus's room and then directly at where she was standing. The charge nurse's pen moved across the unit bulletin board in red marker. Danielle could read it from 30 feet away because she'd trained herself to read things at a distance. Her eyes picked up the letters like weapon systems acquiring targets, written warning. Danielle Ross. Insubordination. Scope violation. She didn't move. She didn't look away. She let herself absorb it the way you absorb incoming fire, cataloging it, understanding its trajectory, deciding how to survive it. By noon, the break room had become a minefield. Danielle sat at the corner table with coffee that had gone cold sometime between 11 a.m. and the moment she stopped paying attention to time. 3 nurses came in together, their lunch bags in hand, their voices bright and artificial. They saw her. Their eyes met hers for exactly 1 second. Then they turned and left without speaking, their shoes making soft sounds against the tile that felt like doors closing. A resident came in next, his phone already pressed to his ear. He grabbed his coffee from the refrigerator, saw her, said something inaudible into the phone, and walked back out before the door had time to close behind him. The break room entered the way rooms do when someone contagious sits down. Danielle drank cold coffee and didn't feel anything about it, which was its own kind of victory. In Ramadi, she'd learned that pain was information. Loneliness was information too. It told you how badly you'd threatened the system. It told you how afraid they were of what you knew. That evening, Hargrove returned to Marcus's room while the shift was changing, that particular moment when the day nurse was going home and the night nurse wasn't quite present yet. Commander Mitchell stood at the window, watching the Savannah heat shimmer off the parking lot. The boys' monitors beeped in their mechanical rhythm, the sound of a body that was forgetting how to work. Hargrove spoke without greeting anyone. His voice had the quality of someone addressing a conference, not a father and a nurse. "Commander, I want to assure you that your son receives our highest standard of care. But hospital environments can be complicated. Staff sometimes let personal feelings interfere with professional judgment. Some nurses, for instance, confuse advocacy with competence. We have protocols that exist for good reasons. They protect patients like your son by ensuring decisions are made by trained physicians, not by well-meaning but ultimately untrained subordinates." Danielle stood at the doorway taking the hits methodically. One measured breath. She'd learned this too in Ramadi, how to absorb punishment without showing the impact. How to let words land without flinching. How to keep your spine straight while everything inside you hollowed out. A single tear escaped. Just one. It surprised her. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, the way a soldier removes water that got in their eyes during heavy rain. Functional. Minimal. Unmoved. Her voice came out steady as surgical steel. "That child deserves better than your cowardice." The words hung in the room like they'd been suspended in amber. Hargrove's smile tightened at the corners. He'd expected anger maybe. Expected her voice to crack. Expected the kind of emotional response that would confirm every assumption he'd made about why women didn't belong in positions of real responsibility. What he got instead was a nurse standing in the doorway with tears on her face and ice in her eyes, saying the quiet part out loud. That insubordination just became additional documentation, Hargrove said coldly. I'll be sure the nursing board hears about your repeated boundary violations. Crash cart Kathy appears to have forgotten her place. He turned back to the chart, dismissing her from reality entirely. Danielle stepped back into the hallway and closed the door. The written warning was still on the unit board in red marker. Someone had already added a second line in Hargrove's handwriting, verbal warning to Danielle Ross, insubordination and disrespect to attending physician. She didn't go back to the break room. She went to Marcus's bedside during her assigned rounds and checked his full line, updated his chart, and didn't speak. The boy's eyes followed her. His hand moved slightly, a question his body couldn't quite voice. You're going to be okay, she told him. It wasn't a promise. It was information she was giving him the way soldiers give information in the dark. You keep moving. You keep breathing. You don't look back. That night, during the quiet hours between midnight and the nurse's shift change, when hospitals became their truest selves, Danielle sat in her car in the parking lot and pulled her jacket open. The faded unit patch was still sewn into the lining where she'd kept it for 3 years, embroidered insignia worn soft from her fingers touching it in moments like this. The Coast Guard emblem surrounded by the names of operations she didn't speak about anymore. Ramadi. Fallujah. 3 deployments. 7 years she'd locked away inside her ribs. The patch had been removed from her dress uniform the day she walked away. No ceremony. No fanfare. Just a discharge and a request that she maintain silence about what she'd seen and what she'd done and how she'd kept 17 people alive in a burning compound when the whole building was coming down around them. And now she was sitting in a car in Savannah, Georgia, watching a hospital that didn't know her, wouldn't believe her, wouldn't let her save a child with everything she'd learned about saving people when the system was failing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing exactly what she was going to have to do about it, and knowing that the moment she did, everything would change. 11 o'clock came to the pediatric ICU like a held breath. Danielle checked her watch, 23:07, as she pushed the cart down the hallway, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly yellow that made the night feel like it lasted longer than it actually did. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. That was intentional. After 2 weeks of staff members leaving break rooms when she sat down, of charge nurses reassigning her to the isolation cases, of whispered conversations that stopped the moment she turned a corner, Danielle had learned to move like a ghost through Mercy General's corridors. She was good at being invisible. She had spent 18 months perfecting it. The boys' room was dark except for the glow of monitors. Marcus Mitchell lay in the bed with the peculiar stillness of a child whose nervous system was eating itself alive, his 8-year-old body betraying him one synapse at a time. Commander Mitchell sat in the chair beside the bed, his dress blues crisp but his face worn like canvas left in the rain. He hadn't slept properly in 4 days. Danielle could read it in the tremor of his hands as he reached for his son's forehead, fear moving through muscle memory. "How is he?" the commander asked, his voice carrying the controlled rasp of someone who had learned to give orders instead of asking for help. Danielle checked the monitors without touching anything unnecessary. O2 sat at 94. Heart rate elevated at 118. Respiration shallow. Too shallow. "We'll monitor him through the night," she said, the meekness still there, still fitting like a well-worn lie. "Let me know if anything changes." What she didn't say, what she couldn't say without violating every boundary Dr. Hargrove had drawn around her, was that the boy's breathing pattern was deteriorating. The shallow chest rise, the slight lag between his inhalation and exhalation, the way his nasal passages flared with each breath, these were the details of a child whose diaphragm was beginning to fail. This was not routine neurological decline. This was the disease accelerating. This was hours, not days. She adjusted the fall line, checked the lock, and moved to leave. As she turned, her hand brushed against her jacket pocket where the unit patch sat sewn into the lining. 3 inches by 2 inches of faded Velcro and embroidered insignia from a ship that no longer existed, a command structure that had dissolved into memory, a life that belonged to someone else. She let her fingers rest there for exactly 2 seconds, then pulled her hand away. At 23:34, the monitor alarm screamed. Not the gentle reminder of a disconnected lead. Not the gradual escalation of a trending vital sign. A flat-out code scream, the heart rate alarm, the oxygen saturation alarm, the respiratory alarm, all wailing in overlapping frequencies that meant the boy's body had just started its final descent. Danielle was in the room 3 seconds after the sound began, her feet moving faster than her mind, muscle memory from Ramadi overriding the careful composure she maintained at Mercy General. Marcus was gasping. His small chest heaved against gravity like he was trying to inhale concrete. His lips were already turning blue at the edges. O2 sat at 71 and dropping. The monitor showed a heart rate of 156, climbing, chasing desperation. His eyes locked onto hers for one fraction of a second, a child's last moment of conscious fear before the body takes over and breathing becomes a command the brain can no longer execute. Danielle hit the code button. The electronic pulse shook through the building, summoning the resuscitation team. She reached for the oxygen mask, already knowing it wouldn't be enough, already calculating the physics of collapsed lung tissue and pressure building in a space the size of a grapefruit. Tension pneumothorax. The words arrived in her mind like a diagnosis she had already known. The boy's left lung had collapsed. Air was trapped in his chest cavity, pressing against his heart, crushing his remaining lung, killing him in real time. Commander Mitchell stood frozen beside the bed, his military composure shattering like glass dropped on concrete. What's happening? What's wrong with him? Step back, sir. Danielle's voice had changed. It was no longer the careful whisper of a meek pediatric nurse. It was command. Pure command. The tone of someone accustomed to people obeying without question. I need space. She paged overhead 3 times. Code blue, pediatric ICU, room for 12. Code blue, 412. Doctor needed now. The intercom clicked. Nothing. No response. No boots on tile. No overhead confirmation. The code had been called. The hospital's entire resuscitation protocol had been activated. And no physician was coming. O2 sat at 58. 70 seconds. That was how long a child's brain could survive on that much oxygen. After that, the damage became permanent. After that, even if she got the heart beating again, there would be no mind left to inhabit the body. The charge nurse burst through the door, eyes wide, hands already moving toward the crash cart. 2 residents rounded the corner behind her, their expressions shifting from sleep-drunk to focused in the space of 2 heartbeats. But the attending, the physician who had to authorize any intervention, who had to take responsibility for every decision, was not with them. Dr. Hargrove's office was 3 floors up. His apartment was 7 miles away. He was not coming in 60 seconds. The calculation made itself in Danielle's mind without permission, without choice, without any voice in her head offering an alternative. The boy had a tension pneumothorax. His right lung was functional but being crushed by air pressure in the pleural space. His heart was being pushed sideways, its efficiency plummeting. The only intervention that could save him before a surgeon could insert a chest tube was a needle decompression, a 14-gauge catheter inserted between the 2nd and 3rd ribs at the midclavicular line, straight into the pleural space, releasing the pressure like opening a valve on a hydraulic system. It was a battlefield technique. It was taught in military medicine because there were no cardiothoracic surgeons in Ramadi. Danielle had performed it 4 times under fire, 3 times on Marines who would have died without it, 1 time on a translator who made it to Baghdad before his stabilization failed anyway. She had muscle memory in her hands that contradicted every protocol Dr. Hargrove had documented for Mercy General Hospital. Performing it would be practicing medicine without a license. It would violate hospital bylaws, physician scope, nursing practice acts, and at least 3 separate policies posted on the break room bulletin board. It would end her career at Mercy General. It would trigger exactly the kind of investigation Hargrove had been trying to engineer since the moment she questioned him about experimental treatment protocols. It would expose every detail of who she actually was. The boy's O2 sat at 49 and still dropping. His heart rate had climbed to 178. The monitor would show asystole in 45 seconds. Danielle's hands moved before the calculation finished. She tore open a sterile field, prepped the 14-gauge angiocath needle with hands that had not trembled since Ramadi, hands that belonged to someone who had stopped being afraid the moment she learned what actual fear felt like. Her fingers found the space between his ribs as if they had done this 10,000 times instead of 4. The anatomy was the same. The physics was identical. The only difference was the uniform. "What are you doing?" the charge nurse asked, her voice climbing. "We need the doctor. We need." "Step back." Danielle didn't look at her. She positioned the needle, angle precise, depth calculated for a child's thoracic cage, nothing like the adults she had treated in the field. She pressed the needle forward. The subtle give as it pierced skin, then fascia, then the thin wall separating lung from the air outside it. Then, the hiss. The hiss of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a collapsed lung re-expanding, the acoustic signature of a body being given permission to survive. The catheter slid home. Danielle secured it with a single piece of tape, no time for dressing, no time for proper protocol, and turned to the charge nurse. "Get me a one-way valve. Vented occlusive dressing. Now." The charge nurse moved. Danielle turned to the residents. "I need someone to call cardiothoracic. Tell them I have a pediatric tension pneumothorax, decompressed, vitals recovering, code in progress." She didn't say please. She didn't ask. She ordered. The boy's oxygen saturation began to climb. 52, 61. 74, his heart rate, still elevated, began to stabilize. The monitor showed sinus rhythm re-establishing itself, the frantic electrical impulses settling into something resembling coordination. Marcus's eyes opened slightly, and he gasped, real air moving into real lungs, and began to breathe like a child instead of a drowning animal. The code ended. Not with the absence of alarm, but with the shift of urgency from cardiac arrest to postcode stabilization. The boy lived. Dr. Hargrove arrived for minutes and 32 seconds after the catheter went in, his face still carrying the slack expression of someone who had been asleep before the page reached him. He looked at the monitors showing climbing oxygen saturation. He looked at the secured catheter. He looked at Danielle's gloved hand still resting on the boy's chest. He didn't check the boy's lung sounds. He didn't look at the vitals. He turned to the charge nurse and spoke with the careful precision of someone placing items into evidence. "Document everything. Every medication, every intervention, every piece of equipment used. Bag all of her supplies. This is now a patient safety investigation." Commander Mitchell stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of 28 years of service. "She saved my son's life. She performed a procedure that—" "Sir, I understand this is difficult, but I need to ask you to step outside." Hargrove's tone was almost sympathetic. Almost kind. The performance of a man protecting hospital liability. "We need to complete the examination without additional people in the room." Danielle peeled off her gloves. One measured breath. The kind of breath that came after 6 hours in a burning building in Ramadi, after pulling Marines out of a structure that was collapsing, after understanding that you had just done something that violated every instruction you had been given but had been the only thing that could work. She placed the gloves in the biohazard container with the precision of someone who understood that they were evidence now. Evidence of crime, evidence of salvation, evidence that the meek nurse in the pediatric ICU was not actually meek at all. "Young lady," Hargrove said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he was certain of his authority, "you are relieved of your duties effective immediately. You are not to provide patient care. You will remain in the hospital pending the arrival of an investigator from the Georgia Nursing Board." He pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking. "I am also calling the hospital board president. This violation is too serious to handle through standard channels." The phone was already at his ear when he added, "And I'm contacting the nursing licensing board. You have practiced medicine without a license on hospital property. That's not a clinical oversight. That's a crime." Danielle stood in the doorway, still in her scrubs, still smelling of antiseptic and fear and the particular electricity that fills a room after someone has done the impossible thing instead of the permitted thing. She looked at Commander Mitchell, whose hand had returned to his son's forehead. She looked at the boy's oxygen saturation, now at 89, now climbing toward normal. She looked at Dr. Hargrove, whose face had gone the color of someone who had just realized that the invisible nurse might not be as powerless as he had calculated. Then she spoke. One sentence. The kind of sentence that never comes from meek people, the kind of sentence that belongs to someone who has spent 18 months learning exactly how much she was willing to lose and exactly what was worth losing it for. "That child is breathing because I acted while you hid." Hargrove's phone call continued, his voice rising as he requested the board president's home number, began explaining the situation, began activating the network of senior physicians and administrators who had made their careers on avoiding exactly the kind of risk that Danielle had just taken. But in that moment, in that room in the pediatric ICU at Mercy General Hospital in Savannah, the sound of a child breathing normally was louder than any threat he could make. Hargrove worked with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years building walls instead of bridges. By 6 in the morning, his calls had already begun. The hospital board president, Gerald Westbrook, answered on the second ring. Hargrove had made sure he was on speed dial, had cultivated him through 14 years of lunches and carefully placed referrals to Westbrook's private practice. The conversation lasted for minutes. "Gerald, we have a liability crisis. Last night, an unauthorized nurse performed an emergency procedure outside her scope of practice. No physician authorization. No protocol approval. She performed needle decompression on a pediatric patient using battlefield techniques that have no place in a modern ICU." Hargrove's voice was measured, reasonable, the voice of a man simply stating facts. "If that child's condition deteriorates and we don't have documentation of physician-directed care, we're exposed. Deep exposure. I'm recommending immediate credential review and suspension pending investigation." Westbrook's response was exactly what Hargrove expected. Concern. Institutional reflex. The promise to convene the credentials committee. By 7 a.m., Hargrove had filed a formal complaint with the Georgia Nursing Board. The document was 17 pages. He cited specific violations, failure to follow chain of command, performing invasive procedures without direct physician oversight, abandonment of assigned protocols during a medical emergency, potential endangerment of a minor. He attached the code documentation, or rather, a carefully edited version of it, showing that he had not authorized the procedure, that he had not approved the decompression, that the nurse had acted unilaterally. The nurses who had assisted her would later testify they were following her lead, not a physician's order. He framed it perfectly, a rogue provider operating outside her credentials, potentially motivated by some kind of emotional attachment to the patient, unfit to practice. By 8 a.m., he had contacted the investigator. Marcus Thorne, formerly a hospital administrator in Atlanta, owed Hargrove more than professional courtesy. Hargrove had helped him exit his previous position quietly when a billing scandal threatened to surface. Hargrove had made a phone call. The scandal disappeared. Marcus had remembered. "I need you to audit someone's background. Nursing staff. Something's off. Her credentials are valid but her history has gaps. References are minimal. Work history is inconsistent. She performed a rogue procedure last night that suggests training beyond what a standard pediatric nurse would have. I want to know if she's actually who she says she is. I want inconsistencies documented." Marcus arrived at Mercy General by Wednesday. He was the kind of investigator who could make questions feel like interrogations without raising his voice. He reviewed Danielle's employment file. He interviewed staff members in the break room, always with Hargrove's framing in place, "We're just trying to understand how this happened." Help us understand her background. The nurses offered what they could. She kept to herself, didn't socialize, deflected personal questions, had minimal emergency contacts, paid in cash for her parking permit. One resident mentioned her hands, how steady they were during the code, how she moved like someone with training that predated nursing school. Another staff member reported that a Walter Reed nurse had come by asking where Danielle worked, had seemed to know her from somewhere. Marcus noted everything. He looked at her references. All accurate, all generic. He checked her educational history, legitimate nursing credentials from a community college, but nothing that explained the level of competence in a high-stress emergency. He contacted the VA, requested service records. Found inconsistencies. Found gaps. Found a name that didn't quite match. Found dates that needed clarification. Found a reason to request mandatory psychiatric evaluation. The letter arrived Thursday afternoon, delivered in person by a hospital security officer to Danielle's apartment. It was from the Georgia Nursing Board. She was being placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. Psychiatric evaluation required. VA Hospital, Atlanta, Monday morning. 10 a.m. Don't be late. The VA hospital waiting room on Monday smelled like coffee that had been sitting since 6 in the morning and the particular exhaustion that accumulates when a building has held human suffering for 60 years. Fluorescent light stuttered overhead. Danielle sat in a metal chair, her hands folded on her lap, staring at the floor. Around her, young men in various states of healing filled the waiting area. A Marine with a prosthetic leg and Desert Storm tattoos on his remaining arm sat 3 chairs away. A Navy veteran with burn scars visible on his neck and hands held a newspaper he wasn't reading. 2 Army soldiers, younger, maybe 23, sat together without speaking. The Marine kept looking at her. Not staring, she would have noticed a stare. But a particular kind of attention, the kind that comes from almost recognition. From memory trying to surface. She didn't look up. She had learned, over 12 years, that invisibility was a skill. That if you made yourself small enough, present enough but not remarkable, people's eyes would pass over you like water over river stone. But her hands were trembling again. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something closer to muscle memory responding to a threat her conscious mind was trying to ignore. A woman in a white coat appeared. Danielle Ross. The psychiatric evaluation took 90 minutes. The evaluator, Dr. Patricia Chen, asked about her military service. Danielle said nothing. Asked about why she had left the Coast Guard. Silence. Asked about her family, her support system, whether she had considered therapy. Danielle stared at the wall and counted the acoustic tiles. The evaluator wrote detailed notes. The note said, patient displays signs of persistent trauma response. Nonverbal when asked about service. Exhibits hypervigilance. Hands show tremor consistent with PTSD symptomatology. Recommend further evaluation before clearance for patient-facing roles. By Thursday afternoon, Hargrove had received a copy of the psychiatric evaluation summary. By Thursday evening, Danielle's badge had been deactivated in the system. By Friday morning at 7 a.m., Hargrove arrived at Mercy General with a folder containing her termination notice. He found her in the pediatric ICU, checking on Marcus Mitchell's medications, a task she had no authorization to perform, but which no one had yet stopped her from doing. The boy was sleeping, his breathing easier than it had been 48 hours ago. The ventilator was set to lower pressures. The color in his face was better. Ms. Ross. Hargrove's voice carried across the unit. Loud enough for everyone to hear. You're escorted from the building. Effective immediately. Your employment is suspended pending the outcome of the formal investigation. You are to have no contact with patients or staff. Security will see you out. A security officer materialized beside her. Danielle stood, set down the medication chart, and walked toward the elevator without speaking. She didn't look at the boy. She didn't look at Hargrove. She moved with the kind of stillness that comes from holding everything together through sheer will. But as she passed the nursing station, Commander Mitchell appeared in his son's doorway, watching through the glass. His face was a map of helplessness. Behind him, Marcus called out, a small voice, confused, scared, "Nurse Danielle? Where are you going?" She pressed the elevator button. Waited. The doors opened. She stepped inside and let them close. Hargrove had positioned himself perfectly. He watched her go. He had made calls to every major hospital in the region. He had documented her instability. He had framed her heroism as recklessness, her quick thinking as poor judgment, her intervention as proof of an unfit provider operating outside her scope of practice. The system would do what systems do, it would protect itself. A single nurse, no matter how skilled, no matter what she had done to save a child's life, was expendable. The institutional machinery would grind forward. Hargrove had built his reputation on making sure of it. That night, Danielle sat in her apartment in the dark. Her badge was on the kitchen table. The patch was still sewn inside her jacket, the only thing from her military service she had allowed herself to keep visible, and even that hidden. She was 41 years old. She had served 12 years in the Coast Guard. She had saved a child's life by performing a procedure that violated every protocol in the hospital's handbook. And she was about to lose her nursing license because she had done the right thing at exactly the wrong time, in front of exactly the wrong people, in a system designed to protect doctors like Hargrove instead of protecting patients like Marcus Mitchell. What that night didn't show was what was already in motion. What Hargrove didn't know was that the hospital's IT administrator, a former Marine named Crawford who had spent 8 years in the Electronics Warfare Division before his discharge, had been systematically backing up server data for months. Crawford had noticed inconsistencies in Hargrove's documentation. Had noticed how the code files had been edited. Had run a recovery process on deleted files. Had found the original versions. Had found evidence of falsification. Crawford was already on his way to the federal building, hard drive in hand, FBI contact waiting, the machinery of a different kind of system already beginning to turn. But Danielle didn't know that yet. She only knew that she was alone, that she had lost everything again, and that the boy she had saved was crying for her in a hospital room, calling her name in the dark. The morning light hit the ER like a fluorescent accusation. Danielle stood outside Mercy General's automatic doors, rain-soaked scrubs clinging to her ribs, hands shaking. Not from cold. From something else entirely. She'd been home for 6 hours. Staring at ceiling cracks. Waiting for her phone to ring. Waiting for someone to call her back. Nobody had. The message came at 5:38 a.m. Not official. Just a text from Dr. Morrison in the ER, acute MI, anterior wall, 53-year-old male. We're understaffed. Need all hands. Danielle didn't think. She moved. Muscle memory took over, the same muscle memory that had guided her hands through field hospitals in Ramadi, that had kept her steady when the world was falling apart. She was in her car before she finished reading the message. The ER smelled like diesel fuel and antiseptic, that chemical stench that never quite masked the smell of fear underneath. A man lay on the stretcher in Trauma Bay 3, his face the color of old concrete. Oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. The monitor screamed its rhythm, ST elevation on the 12-lead EKG, acute myocardial infarction, the muscle of his heart dying in real time. A cardiologist was 23 minutes out. Maybe less. Dr. Morrison saw her first. Blinked twice. Danielle, you're not. I'm not on shift, she said quietly. But I'm here now. Something in her voice stopped the argument before it started. She moved to the patient's side with the same fluid precision that had once saved 14 men in a firefight that lasted 8 minutes. For access. Blood draw. Cardiac protocol running like water. The Iraqi man's eyes opened. Really opened. Not the confused, medicated opening of someone in cardiac distress. Recognition. Pure, crystalline, no oxygen required recognition. His hand gripped her wrist. His grip was weak, but it meant everything. Habibti, he whispered. Sister. In Arabic. The word he'd used that night in Ramadi when she'd pulled him from the rubble of a collapsed structure after a roadside IED had detonated 200 meters from their position. When she'd held his bleeding hand and told him in his own language that he was going to live. That she wasn't leaving him behind. Danielle's hands trembled. Just for a moment. Just long enough to feel something sharp and dangerous move through her chest. She read his file with her peripheral vision while her hands continued their work. Amr al-Hassan. 53. Iraqi national with asylum status granted in 2009. Defected. Helped coalition forces. Made enemies because of it. Lived the last 15 years looking over his shoulder. I remember you, he said in accented English, between oxygen pools. I remember all of you. You're going to be fine, Danielle said. Her voice had changed. Dropped 2 octaves. Sounded like someone giving orders to people who understood what happened when you didn't follow them. Dr. Morrison, activate the cath lab. We need to move. Nobody questioned her. That was the strange thing about a voice that had once commanded men in a war zone. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like gravity. Like something that changed the air pressure in the room. The doors opened at that exact moment. Not Dr. Morrison with another vital sign. Not the cardiologist arriving early. A girl. 12 years old. Soaking wet. Eyes the color of storm clouds and the expression of someone who had spent the last 6 hours on a computer instead of sleeping. Commander Mitchell's daughter. Senior Chief Petty Officer, the girl said. Not a question. A statement. She held her phone out. On the screen, a Coast Guard personnel database. An official photograph. Danielle Ross, Navy uniform, decorations visible on her chest. The room went so quiet you could hear the heart monitor trying to keep Amr al-Hassan alive. Danielle didn't move. Didn't flinch. She kept her hands on the fall line and said, "Get your father. Tell him his son's blood type." The girl didn't move. She was staring at the woman in front of her the way people stare at something that rewrites everything they thought they understood. That's when the second door opened. A man walked in who shouldn't have been there. Tall. 60s. Retired. Carrying himself with the kind of posture that came from 28 years of jumping out of helicopters. A SEAL. Visiting his own child in the pediatric ward, he told the hospital yesterday. Stopped in the ER to grab coffee. Found himself standing in front of something that made the air pressure change. That Senior Chief Ross, the SEAL said. Not loud. Just loud enough. Navy Cross. 2 Purple Hearts. Saved 14 men in Ramadi before her medevac got shot down. Someone else walked past. A resident. Froze. Looked at Danielle. At the monitor. At the Iraqi patient gripping her hand like she was the only thing tethering him to the world. Within 90 seconds, 12 people in the ER knew. Within 5 minutes, everyone in Mercy General knew. Danielle kept her eyes on Amr al-Hassan's vital signs. O2 sat climbing. 87, 89. 91, stable. Her hands moved like they'd never left the battlefield. Like the whole reason she'd tried to become invisible, the trembling, the nightmares, the reason she'd buried herself under scrubs and 12-hour shifts in a pediatric ICU, was never about fear. It was about discipline. It was about waiting for the moment when she'd be needed again. It was about now. The cath lab doors opened. The cardiologist arrived, took one look at the setup, took one look at Danielle's hands, and didn't ask a single question. Just said, "Get him upstairs." "I'm ready." That was at 6:14 a.m. At 6:22 a.m., FBI agents walked into Dr. Hargrove's office on the 4th floor. They didn't have a warrant yet, but they had something better, a federal complaint from the IT administrator, 22-year Marine veteran named Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, who had quietly saved every frame of security footage from the night of the code blue instead of following Dr. Hargrove's direct order to delete it. "This is the footage from 11:33 p.m., Webb said, his voice steady, clinical, like he was briefing a superior officer. Nurse Ross called code team to the pediatric ICU. This timestamp shows the call registered. Here's Dr. Hargrove receiving the alert via beeper. Here's him reading it. Here's him putting the beeper down and returning to his dinner in the physician's lounge." The agents watched. Nurse Ross called again at 11:49. Again at 11:50. At 11:51 p.m., when nobody came, she performed an emergency needle decompression using a 14-gauge angiocatheter at the second intercostal space. The child's oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 94 in 90 seconds. The child lived because of that intervention. Dr. Hargrove didn't arrive until 11:58. Webb pulled up another file. What I'm about to show you is Dr. Hargrove's access log for the security system. At 12:44 a.m., he accessed the footage database using administrator credentials he obtained from my department head, who is no longer in that position after he authorized the access. Dr. Hargrove attempted to delete the video files from 11:19 p.m. through midnight. Did he succeed? The lead agent asked. A woman in her 40s. "Eyes like someone who'd seen institutional corruption before." "No," Webb said. "I'd already backed up everything to external drives. 3 separate locations. Filed a federal whistleblower report under healthcare fraud statutes yesterday morning." Dr. Hargrove's documentation also shows a pattern. He refuses complex pediatric cases while billing maximum consultation fees. That's negligent endangerment combined with fraudulent billing practices spanning 14 months. The pattern is systematic. The door opened. Dr. Hargrove. He took one look at the agents, one look at the monitors displaying his own security footage, and his face drained color like someone had pulled a plug. "This is about an unqualified nurse performing procedures beyond her scope," he said. His voice sounded thin. Desperate. Like a man watching his entire architecture collapse in real time. "She violated every protocol. I was protecting this hospital." The FBI agent cut him off with the precision of a scalpel. "We're investigating you, doctor. For falsifying medical records. For obstructing an investigation into patient care failures. For fraudulent billing practices. Those are federal offenses." The hospital board president arrived 17 minutes later. Not angry at the FBI. Furious at Hargrove. "You told me she was rogue," the president said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You didn't mention your response delay to that code killed our liability defense. We trusted you. You lied to this institution." The outside investigator Hargrove had hired to audit Danielle's background came forward with something unexpected. Danielle's full military record. 22 years of service documentation. 15 years of combat medicine. Commendations. A Navy Cross. Medical training that made her credentials the most advanced in the building. This woman, the investigator said quietly, is the most qualified medical professional here. Hargrove's network collapsed like a building demolition. Board members stopped returning his calls. The Georgia Nursing Board closed his complaint against Danielle and opened an investigation into him instead. His allies scattered. The room went dead silent except for the sound of his career imploding in real time. Danielle didn't watch any of it. She was upstairs, in the cath lab, with her hand on Amr al-Hassan's shoulder while the cardiologist threaded a guide wire through his left anterior descending artery. 2 stents. 30 minutes. A man who'd survived roadside explosives and death threats was going to live another 40 years because a woman he'd known in a war zone had walked back into a hospital she'd been forced to leave. By noon, Commander Mitchell's son was allowed back to his bedside. He watched through the window as Danielle was escorted back into the pediatric ICU, this time by the hospital CEO personally, who was apologizing in the way people apologize when they've realized they were standing next to a legend the whole time. I didn't know, the CEO said. We didn't, I apologize, Chief. Danielle nodded. Just once. The movement was a dismissal. A grace note. An acknowledgement that the apology had been received and was now irrelevant. Because Danielle wasn't angry anymore. The trembling had stopped. The hands that had shaken from hypervigilance in remedy were steady again, because she'd finally been asked to do what she was built to do. Save lives. In the light. Where everyone could see. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, leave a comment. And if you want to see what happens next, how Danielle builds her new life, how the hospital changes its entire emergency response protocol, subscribe, because we're just getting started.